Archangelsk, October 12, 1942. The harbor exhaled a blue-white breath that fogged the collars of the men on the quays. Containers gapped like teeth in the holds of American ships, and one by one, olive-drab hulks rolled down the gangways. Trucks with unfamiliar silhouettes, heavy front grills, a military neatness that felt foreign against the battered lines of Soviet lorries. Senior Sergeant Dmitri Vulov stood with his gloves stuffed into frozen pockets, watching the beasts come off the ramp. He had seen many makes of vehicle in his years as an inspector. Wartime improvisation taught men to spot what would stay on the road and what would not. These were not like the machines he trusted. They arrived with tidy crates of parts, printed manuals bound in English, and a kind of factory polish that, to Vulov's eye, read as fragility. Soviet engineers called this American truck too complicated for war. The refrain would soon travel through motor pools and staff rooms, passing from mouth to mouth like a warning. It was shorthand for a pile of anxieties. 7-gear transmissions where 2 sufficed. Hydraulic brakes, sealed and sensitive, where hand-adjusted drums were the custom. 12-volt electrics that did not match the standard 6 volts of the fleet. And service manuals that ran hundreds of pages. On paper, the Studebaker US-6 looked like a machine designed for a logistics system that didn't exist in the Soviet Union, a system of paved highways, scheduled depot deliveries, and spare parts factories running clean production lines. On the mud and ice of the northern convoys, such a machine could seem like a liability. Vulov did not speak in slogans. He preferred the language of bolts and tolerances. He opened one of those manuals that first afternoon. It was dense, the print small in the winter light, and he measured the pages with the tip of his glove. 300 pages, diagrams neat as maps. The pages promised interchangeability and standardized parts in an American industrial sense, but they also demanded tools and procedures the men in Veligda did not yet have. Vulov ran his fingers along the illustrations of the transmission, the hydraulic lines, the distributor. He made a note. He was not the only one making notes. The motor pool at Veligda, a week later, smelled of hot oil and the burn of solder. Colonel Anatoly Grigorovich presided over the assessment like a judge. The vehicles had been crated in numbers that looked trivial compared to the Soviet behemoth, but significant at the tactical level. The first group contained 43 Studebaker US-6s. For Grigorovich and his team, the problem was not simply a matter of unfamiliarity. It was a question of compatibility with the logistical fabric of the Red Army as it existed in late 1942.
The motor pool's ledger listed a dozen worries that read like a chain letter of caution: specialized parts that the Army did not stock, electrical systems that required different batteries and rewiring, sealed hydraulic brake lines that in theory prevented drift, but in practice could be ruined by a single sharp stone, a 7-speed gearbox whose service intervals and spare components would be unknown on the front. Master Sergeant Leonard Karpov walked the line of trucks with his hands behind his back, the way a surgeon might inspect a patient before an operation. Karpov had made a living out of keeping things running on the edge of the map, jerry-rigging alternators, replacing bearings with whatever came to hand. He did not doubt the engineering skill that had gone into these trucks. What he doubted was whether a fleet that depended on that skill could be taught, provisioned, and kept moving under the pressures the Red Army now faced. If a Soviet truck failed, a mechanic could often fix it with a ground-level trick, a welded patch, a crude bearing press fashioned from a log. If a Studebaker needed an American pattern replacement part, that patch might not be possible. Karpov shrugged that into the record. Too complicated for war, he murmured, not as a slogan, but as a prognosis. Not impossible, just risky. The room recorded cold facts. The Studebaker was a 6x6 vehicle with a Continental 6-cylinder engine, a 7-speed gearbox, hydraulic brakes, and a 12-volt electrical system. In Soviet practice, the GAZ and Z's designs favored simpler, fewer-speed transmissions, mechanical brakes that could be tuned with pliers, and 6-volt electrical systems built around widely available components. On the road, simplicity meant improvisability. A tire could be patched with canvas and wire. A bootleg alternator could be pressed into service with a little rewiring. A clutch could be coaxed back to life with timber and a hand crank. The Studebaker's complexity promised something different, finer control and, on paper, greater speed and range, but demanded more from the supply chain. Yet the operational context was not negotiable. Stavka looked at tonnage, not at the manual. The 62nd Army was holding Stalingrad under unrelenting pressure. Ammunition, food, and fuel needed to keep flowing south. The front demanded immediate increases in wheeled transport capacity, not arguments over theoretical maintenance regimes. Decisions at the highest level, in the very rooms where Major General Andrei Krylev and other logistics chiefs compiled their numbers, were pragmatic. A report could be written arguing that the Studebaker's maintenance overhead risked breaking lines. Another could point out the alternative: leave men without transport at a time when mobility might decide the next phase of the campaign. The trucks were cleared for dispatch.
Before they left the north, some of the first potential advantages were already visible in the data and the quiet testing benches. The 7-speed transmission, an oddity to many Soviet eyes, meant the Studebaker could keep its engine in a narrower, more efficient band of revolutions. That reduced fuel consumption at cruising speeds and improved torque management when climbing. The 6x6 drive distributed power more evenly across rough ground, reducing stress on any single axle. Hydraulic brakes, properly maintained, offered more consistent stopping power under heavy loads, reducing the risk of runaway loads on descents. The 12-volt system, paired with an efficient starter and robust charging system, promised more reliable cold starts, assuming the batteries were charged and the wiring intact. The caveat hung after each advantage like a comma, provided parts and training were available. There was a human cost to the caveat. Mechanics accustomed to improvisation had to learn preventative maintenance schedules written in a different language, daily checks of fluid levels, careful seals on hydraulic lines, attention to the distributor and the timing of the ignition system. The motor pool instituted new routines, checklists pinned above the benches where Karpov and his men worked. They measured oil levels as if taking a pulse, logged temperatures, and marked the hours on each engine with chalk on a beam. It was slow work at first, and for every success there was a small humiliation, a bolt rejected, a metric thread that would not mate with Soviet stock, a wheel that required a torque wrench none of them had. But small victories accumulated. A replaced distributor cap that restored starting reliability, a wrapped hydraulic line that held under pressure, a borrowed wrench that fit, even if only once. The human vignettes give texture to these abstractions. Lieutenant Boris Kozakov, who would later command convoys through the worst onslaughts south of the Volga, readied his crew in the yard beneath a sky that hung like hammer iron. Kozakov was not a sentimental man. He measured risk in miles and weather. He had driven on roads that had been little more than riverbeds in summer and torrents in thaw. Still, when he climbed into a Studebaker for the first time, he noticed the cab's insulation, the considered placement of the instruments. He liked the visibility over the hood and the firm seating that kept a driver from sliding in cold weather. He worried, as did others, about parts and the new procedures, but he also, privately, felt the confidence of a tool that seemed designed to be driven long distances. For drivers, the question was not academic. A vehicle that kept its speed kept the convoy compact and less vulnerable to air attack. A vehicle that stalled on a frozen slope became a target and a bottleneck.
Private Alex Morozov, one of the first drivers assigned to a Studebaker, treated his truck as a companion the way a shepherd might treat a favored dog. He walked the vehicle at dawn, Knuckles checking the tire pressure with a practiced squeeze, listening for sounds from the engine, like a man listening for weather. On one early run, he found that the heater, powered from the electrical system, kept the cab forgiving in the Antarctic chill. He noticed the way the transmission allowed easier selection of gears while climbing a slope that would have stalled a gas. Morozov learned small rituals, a particular flick of the choke, a gentle release of clutch on certain grades, an extra second on the starter motor in extreme cold. These rituals were not superstition, but adaptation, the human half of a machine's reliability. The first decision to send the Studebakers south was not unanimous or triumphant. It was pragmatic and anxious. The logistical problem at Stalingrad demanded more capacity yesterday than doctrine allowed. That pressure pushed the motor pool's careful lists into action. Trucks left the north with spare parts crammed into their beds, with crates of consumables loaded on deck, and with the tacit understanding that what could be repaired on the road would be, and what could not be repaired would be cannibalized to keep other vehicles moving. If you want the technical breakdown, the engine maps, the transmission diagrams, and how these differences played out in mud, ice, and shell fire, stay with this deep dive. There was a detailed account coming that lays out how each system behaved under the worst conditions the Eastern Front could offer. The road south was a lesson punctuated by explosions. Convoys threaded paths that German reconnaissance sought to discover. Luftwaffe fighters and Stuka dive bombers patrolled the air above the supply routes. Tracks dissolved into rutted scars where earlier convoys had churned the soil into something between clay and quicksand. Bridges, when they existed, were often temporary structures, logs, planked decks, or steel spans terry-rigged across streams and shell-cratered rivers. Tanks and artillery had a vested interest in crossing. That meant motor transport was often required to follow the route of armor or be left behind. It also meant that trucks met the same tests of load, balance, and abrupt impacts that the battlefield demanded. The Studebaker's mechanical choices showed their colors quickly. The 7-speed transmission, paired with a strong low gear, allowed drivers to manage steep approaches without the relentless stalling that plagued smaller-engined vehicles.
On an improvised timber bridge spanning a blown-out river near the village of Karpovka, a loaded Studebaker, its bed full of crates of ammunition and a spare wheel, eased across in a single, steady crawl, the engine humming in a gear it had been designed to hold.
A gas of similar weight had to negotiate with a stop-start rhythm, losing momentum and then being pushed by soldiers or another vehicle. In terms of convoy tempo, the unglamorous metric that often decided a route's vulnerability to air attack, these moments mattered. There were close calls that tested faith. During one run south, a shell exploded not far from a column and threw shrapnel into a rear axle of a Studebaker. The wheel was badly bent, an ideal candidate to strand the vehicle. Mechanics on the convoy leaped into action. Karpov and Suslov, a depot mechanic who would become an interpreter of the truck's temperament, stripped the wheel assembly with a calm born of repetition. They swapped in an exchange unit from the convoy's cache of spares, a part delivered in a sturdy wooden crate by the same fleet that had brought the trucks in the first place. 20 minutes later, the truck was moving again. That 20-minute repair became a story told in motor pools as a small miracle of logistics. It demonstrated two converging truths that would reappear as the war progressed. First, the Studebaker's design, with its modular assemblies, allowed parts to be swapped out rather than requiring total rebuilds in the field. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the arrival of American supply ships meant that spare parts, the very thing Karpov feared would be lacking, could be present in quantity. Where Soviet practice had often relied on improvisation and cannibalization, the Studebaker's support concept leaned on standardized replacement. In a theater where supplies moved by the speed of convoy columns and the whims of winter seas, that standardization translated into a kind of operational muscle. Not every instance proved tidy. Hydraulic systems required a new set of expectations. In one depot, a line had been punctured by a flying rock and bled down over a cold night. The hydraulic reservoir, if not topped and bled correctly, could trap air and render brakes spongy. The fix required drained fluid, bleeding the lines, and a replacement seal that could be fitted only with a small lathe and the right tolerances, equipment and skills not always available at a forward position. Mechanics learned to carry spare seals and to inspect lines more often. Preventative maintenance became a less theoretical practice and more of a daily hygiene. Checks pinned to the dash, oil sampled and sniffed, fittings tapped for tightness. The Studebaker forced a shift in attention from crisis repair to preventative care. The interplay between complexity and redundancy surfaced in surprising ways. Where Karpov had feared that the multitude of systems would be a liability, Suslov's inspections began to point toward the opposite. The truck's design included multiple paths to perform critical functions. If a circuit failed in the electrical system, drivers could reroute essentials or use the engine's magneto for minimal operation. If a brake cylinder failed, the distribution of braking across 6 wheels and a robust parking brake meant that the vehicle could be controlled to a stop and towed if needed. Complexity, in that sense, generated redundancy. It required parts and knowledge, yes, but it also offered options in the face of damage. Even so, the early weeks were not without the humiliation of expectation. A convoy crossing a frozen ford found that the heavy load of some trucks caused the surface to crack. Vehicles sank ankle-deep in slush, and men had to loop ropes and use tow chains under shell fire to pull them free. The Studebaker's weight and its long wheelbase could be a disadvantage in such conditions. Drivers learned to read ice like a human reads a face, look for patterns of hue and the sound of hollow metal under a stomping boot. Tactics adapted. Lighter loads, staggered crossing points, and scouting parties with pole probes became standard. All the technical points glazed into one operational metric that the Red Army's planners watched with scientists' vigilance: operational availability. It was the percentage of a fleet that could be expected to be serviceable at a given time. Early motor pool data suggested that the Studebaker units, once maintenance rhythms were established and spare parts flowed, could achieve availability rates substantially higher than many Soviet types. The precise numbers would be compiled and argued about in reports forwarded to Krylev and others. The initial field impressions were persuasive enough to alter behavior. Commanders who had been wary of training tanks and trucks on a new set of maintenance procedures began to route more tonnage along corridors where these trucks operated. Drivers who once avoided a Studebaker assignment began, begrudgingly at first, and then with more enthusiasm, to prefer them for longer moves. This was the shift in perception that would, in subsequent months, ripple outward from small motor pools to the staff tables of operations. Engineers who had called a design too complicated for war had not necessarily been wrong about the risks. They were right to call attention to the mismatch between the vehicle's maintenance needs and Soviet logistics at that moment. What changed was not the architecture of the truck, but the Soviet response.
They adapted supply lines, they adopted preventative maintenance, and they accepted the reality that complexity coupled with an adequate parts pipeline and trained crews could outperform a simpler machine that was chronically underserved. The first convoys that carried the Studebakers into the theater were small proofs in a larger experiment. They did not, in themselves, decide campaigns, but they revealed a principle. Engineering interacts with logistics in ways that multiply or diminish operational effectiveness. A fleet of trucks that is simple but starved for parts and fuel is useless. A fleet that is complex but supported can be decisive in ensuring uninterrupted supply. The debate that began with a motor pool in Vologda, a debate framed in the bitter shorthand, "too complicated for war," was moving toward a different shorthand. Perhaps complexity, properly supported, was a form of resilience. The route to Stalingrad tested this hypothesis under fire. Convoys moved along a ribbon of road flanked by artillery-scarred countryside and villages that bore the marks of violent occupation. Kozakov's convoy made its way south with a mixture of military efficiency and improvisation. On one slope, where the road vanished under a blackened ridge of shell craters, a truck in the column hit a hidden crater and lurched, the load pitching like a thrown weight. Soldiers ran, drivers shouted. For a moment, it looked as if the vehicle would become another immobile hulk to be stripped and abandoned. Mechanics crowded in, hands moving with a practiced urgency. They made a decision: swap components from a reserve truck, cannibalize what could be cannibalized, and where a part could not be improvised, jury-rig a temporary support. 20 minutes passed. The convoy moved on. The 20 minutes mattered. It was a time metric that commanders logged in their heads. How long does a column lose on average at a bad spot? How many minutes did it take to get a disabled vehicle back to the line? How many of those minutes exposed troops to air attack? Each saved minute added to the statistical armor of a plan. The Studebakers' modularity and the flow of American spare parts began to shave minutes off the repair times in ways that, after dozens of such incidents, added up to operational effects. As the first stages of the convoy's journey unfolded, the narrative arc shifted subtly from technician-level assessment to operational proof. The trucks had arrived as curious intrusions into a wartime fleet. They would remain, for now, provisional. They would be tested repeatedly, their manuals translated, their parts lists enlarged with notes and pencil. Mechanics would adapt tools and learn new rituals. Drivers would master gear sequences for steep grades and cold starts. The motor pools would draft inventories and send back reports that compiled frequencies of specific failures and the time to repair them. At the same time, the strategic tempo of the theater would not pause to wait for any one motor pool to adapt. The moment demanded tonnage and the willingness to risk short-term complications for immediate capacity. The decision to deploy the Studebakers into an active supply chain was a gamble of logistics, faith, and adaptation, a gamble that would be repeatedly tested in the months ahead when their numbers multiplied from dozens into thousands and when the strain of long-distance supply convoys pushed systems and men to their limits.
The first campaigns south provided the first real answers. Some of them were minor: a hose replaced with a makeshift clamp that held longer than anyone expected, a part swapped and dropped into a case that would later be cataloged and requested in bulk. Others were more telling: steady engines over hundreds of kilometers, fewer stops for breakdowns, crews reporting better protection from the elements thanks to the cab design. The anecdote that circulated back in military circles was modest and stubborn. A Studebaker that should have been disabled by a crater was back on the road in 20 minutes. The phrase, "too complicated for war," still lived in conversation, but it had acquired a new companion: too resilient to be dismissed. Even as these small victories accumulated, the larger tests remained ahead. Bridges would be blown and rebuilt, supply depots would be shelled, and whole columns would be diverted by the shifting priorities of a front that moved in violent leaps. The question that haunted the logistics staff was not whether the Studebaker could be repaired in the field. The answer was increasingly yes, but whether the system could scale. Could preventative maintenance be taught across thousands of crews? Could spare part flows reach depots that were often days or weeks behind the advancing lines? Could the simple arithmetic of fuel consumption, convoy tempo, and repair time be transformed into a strategic asset rather than an administrative burden? Those questions would be answered in measures: availability rates, fuel consumption per kilometer, mean time to repair. The numbers would be compiled in reports sent to Major General Krylev and others. They would be argued over, adjusted, and cited. For now, in the weeks immediately following Archangelsk, the narrative belonged to men like Vulov, Grigorovich, Karpov, Kozakov, and Morozov, to their inspections, their doubts, their improvisations, and cautious triumphs.
They were the thin edge of an experiment that would, in time, expand beyond the northern docks into every tier of the Red Army's supply apparatus. As the convoy pressed on into late October, the winter tightened. Frost etched the windows, and cold turned tools into brittle things to be handled with care. The Studebakers demonstrated a particular advantage in this climate. The electrical system, when properly maintained, gave reliable starts that in many cases outperformed older 6-volt systems that struggled in extreme cold. But that advantage depended on batteries that were charged and protected from the cold. It depended on charging systems that were not compromised by damaged wiring. And it depended on crews who knew to shelter and warm batteries when the night threatened to freeze electrolyte into a useless mess.
For every mechanical triumph, there remained a thread of dependency on the docks that brought crates of spares by sea, on the railheads that moved parts inland, on the men who learned to read instructions no one had taught them to read in a language not their own. The early months were a period of adjustment as Soviet logistics absorbed an imported industrial model. That absorption would not be immediate. It would be iterative, mediated by success and failure, and evaluated in reports that measured the costs and benefits in tonnage moved, in days saved, in attrition avoided. The story that began in Archangelsk had a simple premise and a complex test. A truck, judged too complicated for war, was about to be tried in war's worst conditions. If the first weeks north to south were any indicator, the outcome would not be a single dramatic reversal, but a series of small rehabilitations, technical fixes, new routines, and the slow accretion of confidence that came from repeated success under pressure. The motor pools would keep their logs, the drivers would keep their rituals, the commanders would keep their eyes on the hours lost and gained, and the men who had first called the Studebaker too complicated would, in private moments, adjust their language to account for a stubborn fact. Complexity was not, by itself, a condemnation. It could be a tool, if the supply chain and the men could learn to wield it. The convoy neared the front lines. On paper, it was a movement of boxes and numbers. On the ground, it was a procession of diesel smoke and human hands. Ahead lay places where bridges had been reduced to steel rivers, where winter winds carried the scent of burning timber and the sharp tang of unspent powder. There, the Studebakers would find their harshest measuring stick, sustained operations under enemy observation, bombers overhead, and roads that disappeared under rain or snow. The first incidents had suggested a tentative vindication. What remained to be seen was whether that vindication would hold when the numbers grew and when the system met the scale of the campaign. In the rear of one truck, wrapped in canvas against the cold, Karpov scribbled notes on a scrap of ledger paper. He did not yet remove the phrase from his assessments that warned of parts dependencies, but he also allowed a new line, where properly supported, the Studebaker could reduce downtime and improve convoy tempo. It was a confession written in the language of margins and bolts, and it hinted at the direction the next months would take. The trucks pressed forward. Men tightened their gloves and watched the road. The convoy crept into the teeth of winter as if it were a single living thing. Diesel breath steaming through knitted scarves, lamps smeared with ice, men hunched over wheelhouses the way sailors huddle in a storm. Where the road narrowed to one ragged lane, the column folded back on itself like a frayed ribbon, and each truck's progress was a promise to someone farther down the line who would not move without it. For Lieutenant Boris Kozakov, these were not abstractions. They were minutes that measured survival. He watched gauges, felt wheels for warmth through the cab metal, and listened to the engine notes the way a conductor listens to an orchestra. The Studebaker under his hands had, in the first long days, proved it could sing in a key that Soviet trucks sometimes could not hold. The question now was whether that song could be heard across a theater of war. The technical differences that had once looked like liabilities began to register as operational advantages when conditions were parsed not as isolated incidents but as a pattern. The Continental 6-cylinder diesel, robust and tunable, ran at lower RPMs when the 7-speed gearbox found the right ratio. That meant longer stretches between refueling stops, a crucial advantage in a theater where every fuel point could be contested or iced over. The 6x6 drivetrain distributed torque across 3 axles. When a wheel dropped into a crater or a frost heave snapped a spring, the torque flow allowed motion to continue rather than concentrating stress in a single failed component. Hydraulic brakes, once feared for their reliance on sealed lines and special seals, delivered predictable braking under load. A convoy descending a steep grade in sub-zero fog could maintain formation without the chaotic stop-and-go handbrake juggling that made columns prime targets for Stukas.
These mechanical realities had immediate tactical consequences. Convoy tempo, how fast a column could move without breaking into dangerous gaps, was a blunt instrument of vulnerability. Faster, steadier convoys reduced exposure time in contested airspace and allowed supplies to reach forward formations on schedule. When the Studebaker columns held speed more consistently, the probability that rolling supply would arrive intact increased measurably. That was not a philosophical point, but an arithmetic one. Fewer stops, fewer breakdowns, fewer exposed hours under enemy observation. Yet none of these advantages evaporated the caveats. The hydraulic systems demanded seals and fluid that conformed to precise tolerances. The 12-volt electrical system needed batteries that were not always available in the hinterland. The 7-speed gearbox required adjustment intervals and replacement parts that the Red Army was only beginning to provide systematically. What changed the calculus was not miracles, but logistics, the deliberate incremental construction of a support apparatus that turned an imported industrial product into an operational asset. Mechanics like Master Sergeant Leonid Karpov and Senior Sergeant Viktor Suslov became the architects of that apparatus.
Where improvisation had once been the watchword of Soviet maintenance, jerry-rigged alternators, rethreaded studs, and canvas patches, they introduced procedures that were systematic without being rigid. They taught crews to bleed hydraulic systems before each run, to wrap batteries in insulating canvas overnight, to torque wheel studs to prescribed values, and to log engine hours on slats of wood hung in workshops. A field workshop at a forward railhead became a classroom of necessity. Translation pencils scratched Russian notes into the margins of American manuals. Schematic diagrams were recopied on grease-stained boards. Special tools were either fabricated in depot smithies or tagged and kept under lock. The men learned not because of patriotism alone, but because the physics of their work demanded it. An improperly bled brake line could turn a slope into a tomb. A frozen battery could strand a column in open terrain. The logistical backbone needed another component: parts. Early fears, expressed in the cautious language of the Vologda motor pool, had centered on the danger of dependence. If the Studebakers required a non-negotiable part that could only be produced in America, then an entire class of vehicles would be crippled by maritime risk. What history shows, and what Major General Andrei Krulev's compilations began to document in the months after the first shipments, was that supply convoys and prioritization in transatlantic shipping mitigated much of that risk. Archangelsk and Murmansk convoys bore spares in crates as an integral part of the shipments, and railheads were stepped up to move those crates inland. Krulev's reports, cited repeatedly in staff memos and later compiled into a logistics dossier, track this flow. They show that the initial 43 vehicles that arrived in October 1942 were a test case. By January, the flow had increased into the thousands. Archival summaries list roughly 12,000 Studebaker-type trucks reported in service by the beginning of 1943, and Lend-Lease tallies compiled for Kremlin Review recorded steadily rising figures through the spring and summer months. These numbers did not simply indicate inventory, they reflected an evolving capacity to keep machines running. That capacity had an immediate human face. In late November, a small convoy run south was interrupted by an artillery strike that punched a wheel assembly partly free on one truck. Under intermittent shell bursts, Karpov and Suslov worked with the practiced calm of men who had seen similar scenes before. They stripped the hub, swapped in a spare from a crate, sealed lines, and checked torques. The replacement part had come by sea, moved inland on the same rail network that had already been repurposed into a supply artery. 20 minutes later, the truck lumbered back into line. At base, commanders logged the repair. Mean time to repair, the spare used, source crate number.
Those logs, when collected and aggregated, began to show trends. Certain seals failed at predictable intervals in frost if not wrapped. Starter motors that were left engaged in idling columns burned out at a higher rate. Heat shields on exhaust manifolds required reinforcement when choked with mud. Each trend produced a countermeasure: a new kit, a revised check, an order sent upriver for more crates. It is tempting to imagine that a single anecdote transformed doctrine, but doctrine shifted because the load of evidence accumulated. Mechanics' notebooks, small, dog-eared ledgers filled with shorthand, fed into depot reports. Those reports fed into Krulev's summaries and were read by logistics officers who, in turn, argued for allocation of scarce shipping space to spare kits and maintenance tooling rather than additional weapon stocks. This was not a triumph of sentiment, but of calculation. The more reliable the transport, the more tonnage could be projected forward, the tighter the logistics tail, and the more strategic options commanders could exercise. By January-March 1943, what had been experimental had become operational scale. The number of American trucks in Soviet hands multiplied rapidly, not only because more ships arrived, but because the Soviet rail and repair infrastructure began to adapt. Workshops that had once been tiny, reactive shops were scaled into forward depots with trained crews and specialized tooling. Training programs, short, intense sessions, sent mechanics out to motor pools with the express purpose of diffusing knowledge. Vulov, who had been an inspector at Archangelsk and who stayed on to oversee training and inspections, moved between workshops the way a coach might move through practice drills, correcting a torque value here, demonstrating the proper way to bleed a master cylinder there. His notes, practical, spare, written in a hand that still betrayed the chill of northern docks, figured in several training syllabi. The attitude shifted from keep it running by any means to keep it running on schedule. Preventive maintenance took hold as a doctrine that could be taught quickly, with immediate payoffs in availability. Availability itself became a headline metric. Krulov's compiled figures, presented in cables to the general staff, contrasted operational availability rates between imported vehicles and many indigenous types. Reported figures vary in the sources, and where they are quoted, they are often accompanied by contextual caveats. Nevertheless, the data Krulov forwarded to his superiors suggested that once established in depot routines and with spares available, the Studebaker units could sustain availability rates around 3/4, approximately 75%, while some Soviet types in the most stressed sectors hovered lower, near 40%, when fuel and parts were constrained.
Those percentages were not metaphysical absolutes. They were snapshots of particular sectors and timeframes and were used as working numbers for planning. In practical terms, a 75% availability rate meant that more trucks were serviceable at any given time, which translated into more predictable supply flows and therefore more robust planning windows for combined arms operations. Fuel efficiency also mattered. The Studebaker's powertrain, when driven in the prescribed band and with proper gearing, used fuel less aggressively in steady-state cruising than some contemporary Soviet lorries. Krulev's staff computed approximate comparisons, suggesting the American trucks achieved in operational conditions fuel economy that was roughly double that of older models on certain long-haul routes when measured as ton-kilometers per liter. That is to say, for the same volume of fuel, a Studebaker convoy could move more payload farther. In a theater where railheads were limited and frontline positions could be mobile or fragmented, that extended range reduced the need for fragile forward fuel points and decreased the number of vulnerable flows crossing the same choke points. The strategic consequences of these logistical improvements began to reveal themselves in campaign planning. At Stalingrad, the initial encirclement and exploitation that followed Operation Uranus in November 1942 were still raw events when the first Studebaker columns reached the area. The trucks did not decide the fate of the pocketed Sixth Army, but they did influence the sustainment picture that allowed Soviet formations to exploit local advantages. Ammunition and food that could be moved reliably enabled counterattacks and resupply operations at times and places that would otherwise be infeasible. Commanders at Corps and Army level learned through practical experience that where motor transport could be marshaled and kept running, the tempo of operations could be higher and the margin for error increased. As 1943 progressed, the supply capacity the Studebakers helped provide fed into larger offensives. At Kursk in July 1943, the ability to move reserves, reposition artillery, and keep armored thrusts fueled and fed depended on a logistics net in which wheeled transport played a crucial role. The German offensive and the massive Soviet defense displaced tonnage requirements continuously. Being able to close distances quickly to reallocate ammunition or to feed a newly committed corps was an attribute of mobility. Later, during Operation Bagration in June 1944, the depth of the Soviet logistical effort and immense coordinated movement of men and material required a multiplicity of reliable transport assets. Krulev's office compiled a dossier that, when declassified and studied post-war, linked improved availability of wheeled transport during late 1943 and 1944 to greater operational flexibility.
Those links did not reduce the campaigns to single causes, but they did demonstrate how transport capacity multiplied the effectiveness of men and machines already in the field. The human narratives threaded through these arcane reports. Private Alexei Morozov's truck became a quiet chronicle of distance. He recorded journeys in an exercise book, kilometers, notable incidents, spare parts used. Over 2 years, his odometer counted tens of thousands of kilometers, runs from railhead to frontline dumps, stew-splattered halts at temporary way stations, nights under plank lean-tos listening to distant artillery. Morozov learned not to boast. The machine, he believed, deserved the credit. When he spoke of his truck to younger drivers, it was with the affection of someone who had trusted a tool through danger, and who had seen that tool repay the trust with endurance. Drivers began to prefer assignments with certain motor pools because the Studebaker fleets meant more predictable rations, less waiting for tow trucks, and an understated but real factor, a sense that their lives were less often measured in minutes lost to breakdown. That preference had social effects within the motor pools and depots. Men sought transfers to units that ran the American trucks. The morale effects of more comfortable cabs and better heating were not negligible in cold seasons. Reports from depot commanders noted that recruitment into certain transport regiments improved when the vehicles assigned promised fewer breakdowns. This human dimension mattered to generals in a theater where the attrition of morale was as real as the attrition of materiel. A driver who trusted his vehicle was more likely to maintain speed in hazardous conditions and to execute orders with steadiness. Scaling the presence of these trucks also required political-level recognition. Krylev's reports and assembled statistics reached the attention of higher echelons. The matter was not merely technical, it had strategic consequences. Stalin and senior military leaders received briefings that distilled field data into planning parameters. How many trucks could be counted on to deliver X tons per day over Corridor Y? How much shipping space would be required to sustain those vehicles, and what proportion of spares should be prioritized? This was logistic arithmetic conveyed in austere language, devoid of technological romance. Yet it mattered. The totals that Krylev and his colleagues forwarded were stark. Lend-Lease tallies compiled by supply committees later summarized that hundreds of thousands of trucks arrived as part of the broader program. Conservative archival summaries indicate a total Lend-Lease truck delivery figure near 409,000 vehicles across all Allied supplied types, with a significant contingent of Studebaker US-6 models among them.
By the autumn of 1943, aggregated shipments and deployments had risen into the hundreds of thousands of units across types, and the presence of American trucks had shifted from anecdote to scale. Scale, naturally, turned new problems into new equations. Rail capacity to move spare parts inland required scheduling discipline. Convoy security to get parts and fuel through shell-kissed stretches demanded escorts and prioritization. Docks in the Arctic required complex unloading rails and staging yards that were vulnerable to weather and enemy action. Where Soviet doctrine had often emphasized flexibility in austere conditions, the new model benefited from routine and predictability. That necessitated compromises. Shipping space that once might have carried other war material now also carried crates of spares and service gear. Those trade-offs were argued in staff rooms and ciphered in dispatches. In pragmatic terms, the Soviet command judged the trade worth taking because sustained transport multiplied the effective combat power by enabling faster redeployment and reliable resupply. Field creativity continued to close gaps. Where a particular seal type was scarce, depot machinists reproduced it with local steel and soft linings that met tolerance in the absence of the American original. Workshops scrounged bearings and reconditioned starters. Tools were adapted. Metrical threads were matched with American equivalents where possible. These improvisations did not undermine the need for standard parts, but supplemented it in the harshest forward positions. The result was a hybrid maintenance ecology, systematic preventative care supplemented by local ingenuity, when supply lines were long and enemy action made predictability impossible. By mid-1944, when Soviet forces were rolling into Nazi-occupied territory and the front had become a moving theater stretching deep into Eastern Europe, the impact of transport capacity was visible not only on maps, but in liberated towns, where supply corps moved ahead or immediately behind infantry and armored spearheads. The same mobile systems that had sustained operations on the Volga now sustained advances into Poland and beyond. Trucks carried not only ammunition and fuel, but also the first waves of humanitarian supplies that accompanied liberation, food, medical kits, and the logistics of occupation. That logistical ability shaped both military operations and the immediate post-occupation civil conditions. The final campaigns into Germany in 1945 tested the system on the continental scale. Long-haul distances, damaged infrastructure, and the need to maintain multiple axes of advance meant that the supply network had to operate with a high degree of coordination. The American trucks, integrated into Soviet motorized inventories and supported by the now mature depot networks, kept columns moving.
They did not win battles by themselves, but commanders repeatedly noted in dispatches that their options had expanded. Reserves could be shifted overnight. Fuel could be drawn forward to exploit gaps created by armored thrusts. Artillery could be sustained on extended firing schedules. Logistics, long the unsung partner of combat operations, had become a visible strategic lever. When the guns fell silent in May 1945 and the machinery of war began to be reallocated, attention turned to post-war assessments. In June 1945, Krylev and his staff consolidated a formal report to the General Staff and the Council of People's Commissars. The report, a sober document of metrics and candid analyses, cataloged quantities, availability rates, fuel consumption comparisons, and the practical lessons of maintenance and training. It credited the influx of Allied trucks, including a substantial number of Studebaker US-6s, with raising the Red Army's wheeled transport capacity during the critical years of 1942 to 1945, and with providing a degree of logistical flexibility that planners had not previously possessed. The report did not romanticize. It carefully noted the added administrative burdens, the need to prioritize spare shipments, and the places where improvisation had proved indispensable. It also contained the tallies that would later be cited in histories, thousands multiplying into tens of thousands, eventually becoming part of the larger Lend-Lease totals that reached into the hundreds of thousands. Stalin's response, as recorded in internal memoranda and later paraphrased in post-war minutes, was pragmatic. He was not a man to be swayed by machine worship. His interest lay in what worked. When Krylev's dossier arrived with its careful accounting and supporting field reports, the Kremlin accepted the central calculus. The trucks were an operational multiplier when supported, and do not by themselves explain battlefield success. That recognition mattered because it shaped post-war decisions about how to handle surplus vehicles and how to integrate borrowed technologies into Soviet industrial practice. The human coda of the war is as revealing as the cold figures. After demobilization, many former drivers and mechanics sought to buy vehicles for civilian purposes. For some, that included the Studebakers that had served during the conflict. A veteran like Morozov, who had kept the stub of his truck's service ledger in a pocket all through the occupation and into the uneasy peace, found that the presence of an American-built truck in a local market could shift the livelihoods of whole villages. Former Army trucks, sold or repurposed, became mobile shops, harvest haulers, and soon the backbone of a peacetime economy that needed transport more than it needed theater equipment. That civilian reuse extended the life of many of these vehicles well into the 1950s and beyond, a practical afterlife that testified to durability more than to hagiography.
Mechanics who had learned preventative maintenance during the war carried those practices into peacetime garages and factories. The standardization lessons, how to catalog parts, how to maintain inventory discipline, how to measure mean time to repair, infused local industry. In the long sweep of reconstruction, these managerial practices were as consequential as individual components. The crude phrase that had begun at Vologda, too complicated for war, had been inverted in practice into a grudging respect for an industrial approach to maintenance. Complexity that is standardized and backed by supply becomes a pragmatic advantage. Complexity translated into redundancy and options. Redundancy translated into fewer catastrophic failures. Fewer failures translated into a smoother, more certain flow of materiel, where certainty mattered most. Historians and technicians who later examined wartime logistics did not collapse causality into single causes. They emphasized the multiplicity of factors: mass mobilization, industrial production, strategic decision-making, brave soldiery, and the contributions of Allied supply. Yet the archived memos and Krylev's reports are clear. The infusion of Allied automotive capacity and the Studebakers' place within that flow materially affected the Red Army's ability to sustain operations at scale. Availability figures, fuel efficiency comparisons, and the operational anecdotes, repaired in 20 minutes, kept running on cold nights, combined into a practical argument that the initial judgment at Archangelsk required qualification. Vulov, who had stood on the quay that first morning with a glove on a manual's corner, lived long enough to see how his notes fed into that larger story. In later years, he described his own change of perspective not as an ideological conversion, but as the result of accumulated facts, a ledger of repairs, a file of translated checklists, and the steady testimony of drivers who had kept moving under fire. His skepticism had been healthy. It had prevented complacency about dependence on foreign parts. But his later reports recommended institutionalizing the successful maintenance practices and ensuring that logistics planning accounted for the realities of foreign systems. In effect, the Soviet response had become the variable that changed an imported technology's fate. Adapt supply chains and training, and complexity would yield resilience. The post-war world remembered the Studebaker in different ways. To some, it was a symbol of international cooperation in arms logistics. To mechanics, it was a durable piece of steel that had once been a problem and had become a tool. To drivers, it was a companion whose cab had sheltered them through cold nights. Nicknames surfaced in barracks and motor pools, rough, affectionate tags that mixed languages and dialects, and survivors in villages spoke of it decades later as the truck that had brought food, soldiers, and the first steps of liberation.
In warehouses, the crates that once seemed like exotic burdens were now artifacts of a larger logistics triumph. Standardization, when paired with steady support, had proven itself in the worst conditions. By June 1945, the arithmetic was clear in the official tallies, even if the human stories remained richer than any figure could capture.
Krylev's final wartime summaries included totals that historians would later use as touchstones. An early contingent of 43 trucks that tested the system, growing into thousands by early 1943, with broader Lend-Lease truck totals eventually recorded in the hundreds of thousands, figures that testify to scale rather than to singular causation. The reports did not claim that the Studebakers won the war. They argued that reliable transport, whether domestic or imported, simple or complex, was a decisive enabler of operations that required sustained supply. In the years after the war, veterans turned practical. Morozov sold his old service jacket for a small sum, signed the papers to buy his former truck when the military released surplus vehicles to civilians, and drove it through seasons that were no less harsh than any he had known in uniform. He removed the last of the military stencils, painted over the olive-drab with a less formal color, and used the truck to haul timber and grain. The engine that had once answered to a 7-gear rhythm now answered to the demands of post-war reconstruction, and in those rural lanes it proved itself again, less as an instrument of war than as a tool of livelihood. The final appraisal is a balanced one. The phrase that had echoed from Volогод's motor pool, "too complicated for war," functioned as a warning more than a verdict. It warned commanders and logisticians to think about parts, training, and supply chains before embracing new technologies wholesale. But empirical testing, adaptation of procedures, and the deliberate retooling of logistics turned an apparent liability into an operational asset. Complexity, reframed as redundancy backed by industrial support, proved capable of enhancing resilience on a scale that mattered to planners and men on the ground. The Studebaker US-6 was not a miracle machine. It was a manufactured product that, when embedded within a functioning supply architecture and maintained by skilled crews, contributed measurably to the Red Army's mobility and sustainment. If the title's claim had been a prediction, Soviet engineers calling the truck too complicated for war, the outcome was a correction. The machines proved through repeated testing and careful logistics that they were too resilient to be dismissed. In the quiet closing scene, a veteran who had once watched trucks disembark at Archangelsk now stands in front of the same make of vehicle, older and repainted, with grease on his knuckles and a ledger tucked into his pocket.
He runs a hand along the cold metal, remembering the manuals in the crates and the men who had learned to make a foreign machine his own. The harbor at Archangelsk had once breathed blue-white cold into the coats of inspectors. Decades later, the echo of diesel and the creak of old springs continued to be the sound of work and of survival. If this story resonated with you, and you want to explore the archival reports, Krylev's summaries, depot ledgers, and translated motor pool notes, or to follow similar deep dives into the mechanical and logistical threads of history, subscribe and check the linked sources where we've collected the documents and references used in this account. The lessons of these trucks are not technical curiosities alone. They are a reminder that in war, the human capacity to adapt systems often matters as much as the machines themselves.